Okay, good. Excellent. How's everybody doing? We good? Awesome. So we're going to go through a review tonight, kind of go back through what we've learned thus far, and then we are going to go over to the other building and have the church council meeting and try to get that done as quickly as possible so that we can all go home and eat and sleep. That sound good? Sound good? Okay, good. All right. So tonight, to start off with, there are certain beliefs that are necessary to be saved at the point of salvation. What do we call those beliefs? Salvific. So when we talk about the gospel, what the gospel is, what is that kind of belief? The gospel is comprised of what kind of beliefs? No, not inerrant, the same. The gospel is comprised of salvific beliefs. Yeah. So when we're talking about the gospel, what is the gospel? We are talking about those beliefs that are necessary to be able to be saved. So when we go out and tell people what the gospel is, what we are basically telling them is, what do you need to believe to be saved at the point of salvation? So that if someone was going, if you went up to the street down here in downtown Roseburg, and you just told somebody about the gospel, and then 2 seconds later they're walking down the street, get hit by a car, and die, what would they need to believe at the point that you talk to them in order to be saved? I know, sounds a little far-fetched, but crazier things have happened, folks. So, now where do we determine what the gospel is? The Word. The Word. Does the Bible contain error? No. Will the Bible fail in its purposes? No. So, we have a Bible that is reliable, that you can trust to find out what you need to believe to be saved. Now, granted, does the Bible contain a lot of other beliefs, a lot of other rules for living, a lot of other things other than just the gospel? Of course. But we know that the starting point there is the gospel. Yeah. Mm-hmm. You have to get to that point, which is exactly why we start where? We start with Genesis 1. Because you're exactly right, Mary, and I talked about it a little bit this morning with the new members course. Too many times when we go out and talk about the gospel, we go to, hey, Jesus is God. Here's the problem. You've missed how much of Scripture already. You've skipped over all of the Old Testament before you've even gotten to Jesus is God, which we find and we figure out in the New Testament. And so we need to understand that before we get to Jesus as God, we've got to go through and realize that a lot of people don't even believe that there is a God to begin with. So how can an atheist come to faith in Jesus as God when they don't even believe in God to begin with? That's why we start with Genesis 1. First belief, which we talk about here, the existence of God. Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God. To even start with that, there has to be a belief in the existence of God. We can't talk about Christianity without the existence of God. You cannot be an atheist and be a Christian. Although there are a couple supposed pastors out there who have tried to make that argument that I'm an atheist but I can still be a pastor. That doesn't make any sense. But, first belief, first clear belief, if you want to be saved. Obviously, if you want to be saved, you have to believe in what? God. You have to believe in the existence of God. It makes no sense to not, if you want to be called a Christian, if you want to be saved. Yeah. Or start talking about it. Say in the beginning, God, and then go from there. But don't just say God, don't just start with in the beginning God existed, but what kind of God are we dealing with? A holy and a loving God. First point really, God is a perfect, all-powerful, all-knowing, all-present, good and loving God. Because there are a lot of people out there who don't believe in an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-present, good and loving God. Deal with Hindus. How many gods do they believe in? And they're all different. Not a single one of them are all-powerful. Okay? You've got a lot of imperfect gods out there. So we need to be clear when we're talking about the existence of God, that first part. God exists, and He exists as a perfect, all-powerful, all-knowing, all-present, good and loving God. We are dealing with a God who is holy and loving, and those go hand in hand. We are dealing with a good God. Okay? Why is it that saying that we're dealing with a good God, why is that so important when it comes to the gospel? Everything He made was good. What would it make of the gospel if we believed in a God who could do evil or was evil? Wouldn't work, would it? Doesn't make any sense. It can't happen. God, by definition, is good. We cannot have a God who is anything less. God is good. And so therefore, when we look at this, first off, what did God do? We have this good, loving God, this all-powerful God. What did this God do? He created. God created the heavens and the earth. God created the universe. What does that tell us about our universe? What? It's good? It was created as good? It was created as perfect? What else does that mean? In relation to God, what does that mean about God in the universe? He's the creator. What does that mean for Him? Well, no, what does that mean about what God's place is in this universe? He's the ruler. Why is He the ruler? Because He created it. It's His. What do we call that? Ownership. God has ownership. God created the universe. God created everything in it. That means that He has ownership. Everything belongs to whom? Him. Everything belongs to Him because He created it. And guess what? That includes whom? Us. Man was created by God to be in perfect relationship with Him. Did God just create and then leave? No. He had a what for us? A purpose. God had a purpose or plan. Yeah, that's a good. I thought you said land for a second. I was like, well, yeah, I think you got land for it, but plan, a purpose. God didn't create us for no reason. God had a plan, a purpose for us, and that purpose is relative. It's a relational purpose. We are created to be in a perfect relationship with God. A relationship marked by what? What kind of relationship should we have with God? Should we have with God? Loving, personal, what? Perfect. How should we respond to God? Worship, what else? Obedience. Obedience. We are called to be obedient to God. In this perfect relationship with God, what does that communicate to the rest of creation that does not have this relationship with God? What does this communicate to the rest of creation? Anyone got an idea? We have a unique, perfect relationship with God. One that the rest of creation, no animals, no angels, no anything, has this kind of relationship with God. So what does it communicate about this relationship to the rest of creation? Anyone want to take a stab? It communicates what kind of God we're dealing with. That we are dealing with a good and loving God. The relationship we have with God communicates those two things, that we are dealing with a good and loving God. Sometimes people want to put those things as diametrically opposed. The holiness and the love of God. And they go, how can a good God send people to hell? If he loves people, how can he send them to hell? And how could a good God allow sin to go unpunished? And they look at these two things diametrically opposed without realizing, no, love and holiness go hand in hand. God's love and his holiness go hand in hand with each other. And our perfect relationship with him should communicate this to creation. We were created to be in this perfect relationship with him, and this should reflect in our relationship with him, and it should show God's rightful glory to creation. We don't add anything to God's glory, but we reflect God's glory. That's why we're called image bearers. Like I described it this morning, you take a painting, okay? A painting communicates something. The painter is the one who made the painting, but the painting communicates something about the creator, the painter. Or in other words, let's look at it this way. You put a mirror up to a light. Does the mirror contribute anything else to the light? No. But the mirror reflects the light and shows the light around. We are image bearers. We, in our relationship with God, communicate something to creation, and we reveal his glory by our relationship with him and with each other. At least we're supposed to. What happened, though? How do we define sin? Not just disobedience, more than that. Rejection. Rejection. We see in the Genesis 3 account, the fall, Adam rejects God. Eve rejects God. They didn't want God. They wanted to be God. Man and woman disobeyed God because they wanted to be apart from God. They did not want to listen to God. They did not want to be in this relationship with God. They wanted to be their own gods. And so they rejected God by their action of eating the fruit. But the action of eating the fruit was the manifestation of what is going on internally. That internal rejection of God. So basically this, man and woman, humanity rejected God. And they rejected their relationship, they rejected their purpose in favor of wanting to be their own gods. So let's get this, okay? Gospel right here. First part of the gospel. God exists and is a perfect, loving, and holy God. And this God created the universe and everything in it, including man, who was created to be in this perfect relationship with him. But man did not want to be in this perfect relationship with him. Man wanted to be apart from him. And so man rejected God in favor of wanting to be their own gods. And so man faces consequences for this rejection. Man faces consequences for sin. Because God is the giver of life and we have rejected the giver of life, consequently, we will die. But not just physically, we die spiritually. Both. We face earthly consequences for our sin, which includes problems in the world and physical death. The problems of the world, when people ask, why is this world the way it is? What's going on in the world? Why do we have all of these issues? Do you want to know what the real problem is? It's us. We are the problem. We are the reason why the world is in the state it's in. We have done this. And creation cries out for justice. Humanity has caused these things to happen because of our rejection of God. Because we have introduced sin into creation and injected it into creation, we have injected the corruption that started here into creation itself. The corruption has spread, and because of that, we have consequences on this earth, physically. There are physical consequences for sin, ultimately leading to what? Death. We reject the one who gives life. Of course, what will follow is inevitably death. But here's the thing. Our souls were not built to die. Our souls continue on. So eternal death looks a little bit different than physical death. There's a lot of theologians who will try to claim that hell is really just God snuffing us out of existence. We call that belief annihilationism. Here's the thing. Hell is real. Hell is a real place. We face spiritual consequences of God's judgment. Our souls were not ever built, made, created to be snuffed out. They were created to be eternal. And so therefore our rejection of God is going to have eternal consequences. And so we need to understand what hell really is and what these spiritual consequences really are. Because of man's rejection of God, we will stand at the end of our lives forever separated from God. And we need to know what that really means. That there will be no relationships in hell. God's a relational God. God created relationships. So therefore, there's not going to be any relationships in hell. Caught on this morning, new members class. God created what? First part of Genesis 1. God created light. And so hell is going to be a what kind of place? Dark. Because you rejected the light. So therefore, hell is a dark place where someone is alone, in pain, but not just physical pain, but emotional pain. Because of the guilt that we have been fully introduced to the weight of our rejection of God, and we are forever left with this guilt in place for eternity. Why? Because we chose it. We have chosen to reject God. And so therefore God says, okay, if that's what you want, that's what you're going to get. And so we bear the weight of the consequences of our sin, of our rejection of God. And without God making a way back to Him, we would have no recourse. Why? Because we were the ones who wrecked this relationship. We are the ones who have to pay the price for it. And therefore, we are not the ones who are able to fix it. Who's able to fix it? God is able and is the only one able to fix this. There are consequences for sin, and the only one who can fix those consequences for sin, who can fix it and give us a way back to Him, is God Himself. And so, God provides a way for man's redemption through His Son becoming a man. Man needed God's intervention to repair the relationship and be restored. We could not do this on our own. The entire Old Testament, you really want to know what the purpose of the Old Testament is? It's to point our need for God to make a way, because we can't do it on our own. Romans speaks on the fact that the law was not meant to save. The law was meant to condemn, to show people that they can't do this without God. God, throughout the Old Testament, appears before people, even physically manifests Himself in clouds where people can see the presence of God. And they still do what? They reject. The entire story of Israel is an answer to those people who say, well, if God would just show Himself, then I would believe. No, you wouldn't. Because God's done that before. And guess what? The story of Israel is the story of one rejection after the other, after another, after another. The story of Israel has a lot more evil than it does good. It's proof. It's proof that we can't do this without God. That we are unable to repair this relationship. And so God had to step down. Was God required to step down and do something about this? No. God didn't have to do anything. But yet we see something here. What kind of God are we dealing with? A loving God. A loving God who stepped down to provide a way for his creation to be redeemed. And so God provides a way for man to be restored. Through whom? Through Jesus, his Son. The Son of God, as we see in Philippians 2, the Son of God pours himself out and he humbles himself and becomes a man. Now here's the thing. Here's the tricky part. Jesus is completely God and completely... Can you explain that? No. Don't worry about trying to explain that. Okay? That's one of those doctrines where, guess what? We can't completely comprehend that. We can't. We just know it's true. Yeah, add the whole Trinity, but even there, God became a man. Jesus, the Son of God, was born of a virgin and lived a life following the will of God perfectly. This is the plan of God to redeem humanity, to offer a way out. And so we see the Son of God, Jesus, be born and lived a perfect life following the will of the Father. Why was that so important that that Jesus would have to live a perfect life? Why? Why wouldn't it work? Why couldn't we be saved? A spotless sacrifice needed to be made. If Jesus had any sin whatsoever, it would make him what? Just less than God, just a man. And can just a man fix this relationship? Can just a man provide a way out for us? No. Only God could provide a way out. If Jesus had sinned and gone to that cross and died, he would have stayed dead. Because the consequences for sin is what? Death. But did Jesus sin? No. And so we have our perfect sacrifice. Jesus lived a life completely following the will of the Father perfectly. Is that possible for us to do in this life? No. But Jesus did, because he is God and because he is man, and did it so that he could be that perfect sacrifice, so that he could fully pay the wages of sin, so that he could pay that debt for us. We'll talk more about that death next week. I wanted to give it a week because I know we're going to start getting into the Easter season, so I'm like, I'm not going to steal the thunder of Easter season, so I wanted to wait a little bit for it. But we need to remember here how we've come thus far in this, and how simple the gospel really is. God exists, and he is a good and loving God. He created everything, including man, and he created man originally good, as well as everything in this world. And man was created to be in this perfect, good relationship with God and to live in this paradise with him perfectly for the rest of existence. But what happened? Man rejected that relationship with God. God was the giver of life and of paradise, but man rejected it selfishly because man wanted to be God. And so humanity betrayed God and rejected him. But that brings consequences. There are consequences for rejecting God. And the consequences for rejecting God are death. Not just physical death, but eternal death, where we are forever separated from God in a place called hell, where we are eternally condemned to darkness and to loneliness and to the pain of guilt for the rest of eternity because we chose to live without God. And so therefore God lets us have exactly what we wanted. Yeah. Because they will be in that place. But here's the thing. Because as we get along in the gospel, we realize God didn't leave it there, though. That's not the end of the story. Because we have the consequences, but here's the next part of the gospel. God provides a way out. God comes down himself to live a life of suffering and of rejection, but lives a life perfectly so that he could be a sacrifice for our sins. And so that's how far we've come in the gospel thus far. Guys, how long did that take me to explain? No, this last part right here. I know, 30 minutes for the entire thing. But this last part right here where I started back up reviewing, really less than 2 minutes. Did I miss anything thus far? What? Because you haven't talked to him yet. We don't know yet. So, but thus far, less time than 2 minutes. It's taken me to explain the gospel simply so that someone, did I say anything that was difficult for someone to understand if you'd never heard it? We make the gospel a lot more difficult than it has to be. So, this is the first couple parts of the gospel. We'll start going through the death of Jesus next week and start going through it as we get into the Easter season. And we'll start wrapping this up in the next 3 or 4 weeks. How's that sound? And then we'll move on to the next part of this phase right here, because we're not stopping with me just explaining it. We're going to be doing some projects, folks. So we'll go through that later, though. All right? All right. So it is 6:30. We're going to move over to the next building and go start doing church council. Hopefully it's not an eternally long meeting. I know you guys don't want eternally long meetings, okay?